Hello. The Divine Code reading for July 22nd, pages 89 and 90. This is the chapter on Torah study for Gentiles. Halakha number 3. It is permissible for a Gentile to read the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, Rambam, the Laws of the Torah Scroll, chapter 10, Halakha 8. A Gentile may hold a Torah and read from it. See also Ma'or, Veshemesh, beginning of Hukot. I just wanted to point out also that if a Gentile is holding a Torah scroll, I mean, today the Jews don't really hold and read it from a Torah scroll because we have regular books, we have printed books. Therefore, it's not necessary for a Jew to read from a regular Torah scroll. And so even though it might be permitted for a Gentile to read from a Torah scroll, it's not practical. Torah scrolls today are used for the more of the ceremonial readings during the davening. That's the primary use of the Torah scroll. And there's other uses, but that basically it's of a ceremonial nature rather than a study nature. But apparently we would be allowed to read from it. Now it should be pointed out also that the Torah scroll that is speaking of here would be written in Hebrew. So apparently we are allowed to read the books in Hebrew, just from a practical standpoint. It makes more sense to just have a regularly printed book, and it also makes more sense to read in a language that one can understand. And assumably that would be the language a person of his own nation, such as here it would be English. Even with traditional exclamations of the simple meanings, like the exclamations by Rashi. So the normally printed Jewish the book for study would be in English. I mean, it might have it in Hebrew. And let me get a copy of something here that would help to show this. Here's a book on on Daniel, and it's published as a regular book. And on one side of it, you have the Hebrew, and you have the various commentaries in Hebrew. You also have English. This publisher puts it in English. And you have a selection of commentaries that the editors felt would be useful for the person to read in English. And this is like a normal style. But it is in order to correctly understand the verses. So yeah, the commentaries are there to help us to understand the verses. And we should be looking at stuff that's on a basic level rather than a deeper. But it is forbidden for a Gentile to delve into study of the written Torah, except for the verses that discuss the 7 Noahide commandments. And as mentioned above, delving into Torah means learning in depth and trying to arrive at inner exclamations of the text. So that the more complicated, in depth, there's two different ways of understanding, or at least two main ways of understanding this term, delving into Torah. One way of understanding it is to for the sake of the Torah, just for the sake of delving, like pure science. He's studying not because he's trying to do anything with the science. He has a laboratory, he has studies, just purely for the beauty of learning science. And whether anything comes of it, the person doesn't care. That's a person delving into science. Delving into Torah is similar. The person is just looking for the beauty of the Torah. He enjoys it so much. He doesn't care if he gets anything out of it. That is actually the normal way that a Jew is expected to study Torah. It's just for the beauty of the Torah. Even if nothing comes of it, there's a value for the Jew because he's commanded to study Torah. There's a value for the Jew just to study the Torah. For a non-Jew, there has to be a logical reason for the study, and there's so much practical value in studying the Bible and studying the Torah and the rest of the Bible and the oral Torah and the oral tradition. There's so much value, practical value that's available. That is what the Noahide studies the Torah, studies the Bible for, is that practical value. Now, my experience has been that what's available in English, in an English printed book, typically that is of value. So as a rule of thumb, normal books available in a Jewish bookstore that's in your native language, most likely that falls into the category of practical value, because the stuff that's more esoteric doesn't have a market value to translate. I mean, the stuff that's of esoteric value can be found in Hebrew, but the translators don't bother to translate it just because it's not a practical value. You're not going to find an audience for that. So if you find it in your own language, you're probably finding the basic level commentary. That's what normally is available in your own language, such as this book and just about anything else you find that's in English or whatever your native language is. That's just a rule of thumb. It's not completely that way, but as a rule of thumb, that's how it works. Now, we're allowed to delve into certain parts of the Torah. Now, they're going to give an exclamation of concerning the exclamations of Rashi. It appears that the main traditional Jewish commentators of Tanakh, including Rashi, are not included in the prohibition of Gentiles learning Torah in depth, as it is explained in the Shulchan Aruch, because there it talks about analyzing the text in the way of the Talmud, the Sifri, the Mekilta, by comparing verses and explaining them to draw out the points of the Torah law that are implied within them. But those commentators whose sole purpose is to explain the simple meaning of the text do not derive in-depth conclusions from the verses, even if they occasionally cite words of the sages to explain how the verse is to be understood. It appears that one must look at the main point that the commentator is presenting. In particular, Rashi's intent is only to explain the simple meaning of the verses of the Hebrew Bible. So Rashi is a guide. Rashi, his goal was to make the Torah available to an early age student, to a young student, make the Torah available to him. Now, it turns out that Rashi is also of great value to an older Torah scholars also find Rashi of value, but it's geared in such a way that it makes it available for just a basic student. Concerning the areas of Torah that are available for non-Jews, there's two different ways to look at this. One way is to go through and say, okay, out of the entire scriptures, there's a level that can be understood. It can be understood in the area of benefiting humanity, and those areas we can study. But there's certain sections of scripture that are of unique value to the non-Jew, and it's of a unique value that we can this area of delving would be allowed within certain specific areas of the Torah, that we don't have to be concerned about delving. In other areas, it's a little bit more complicated, but in certain areas, it's more clear-cut that non-Jews are allowed to delve. And this footnote 111, these appear to be only Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 30, chapter 2, verses 16 to 25, and possibly chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 6, verses 1 to 12, chapter 8, verses 15 to 22, chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. The author writes, that's the author of the Divine Code, writes that possibly the first two Torah portions, Bereshit and Noach, are permitted for in-depth study because they basically relate to humanity in general. So that would be the point in the Torah, you know, from in the beginning to the emergence of, you know, to the introduction of Abraham, of Abraham. That section might be permitted, but definitely these specific pieces of Torah would be permitted for in-depth study. So it also needs to be understood that in-depth study is sort of a no holds barred. And even though this is a fraction of the entire Torah, it's one piece of the entire Torah. One piece of the entire Torah is like a universe in itself. Even just a tiny verse, a word, even a letter is a universe of itself when you go in depth, the way it describes in depth in this chapter. And so we're not missing anything by being told, oh, don't study these other areas. Because, well, actually we are allowed to study the other areas. It's not the area, not the in-depth type of study. And having this is more than a lifetime's worth of study. A person could spend his entire life delving into this and only scratch the surface. So it's not as if we're being denied anything. It's more like we're being given a treasure hunt, and the X marks the spot, says dig here. Well, you can get angry and say, why can't I dig somewhere else? But if you know that that's where the treasure is, it doesn't make any sense to dig somewhere else. You should be digging where the treasure is. So this is a very useful list in footnote 111. It is obvious, back in the regular text, it is obvious that it is permissible for a Gentile to recite verses from the Hebrew Bible as prayer, particularly the verses of Psalms. When a person is praying is not the same thing as study. It's a different cognitive thing. Prayer is for the purpose of aligning oneself up. It's saying the words for the purpose of aligning oneself up with the words and to become connected with God in that manner. Torah study is a different, it's a different methodology entirely. So it's stating here that even though we might not be permitted to delve in much of the Torah, the other method of delving, which is prayer, is permitted to a non-Jew. Halakha number 4. The question in Torah, if a question in Torah law arises for a Gentile, and the verdict is not explicit and clearly explained in the permitted sources, he does not have the ability or power to identify the correct ruling, and he must ask a reliable and observant Jewish Torah scholar, for only they have permission to explain the Torah and decide what the correct Torah law ruling is in a particular situation. So the area of being able to study out the Torah laws. Now, this book in its current form is 640 some pages long. It'll expand out a couple hundred more pages by the final printing, and well, maybe another 100 pages by the final printing, and it gives a lot of detail. However, this is basically a start. I mean, this is a basic level halakha book, the Divine Code, and more will be developed as situations come up. The question is, how do we go about figuring these things out as more and more complicated questions come up? A couple of years ago, there was discussion of something called laboratory grown beef. And it's where they take a piece of beef and they cause it stem cells. I'm not exactly sure how they do it. They cause it to grow in a laboratory situation, and eventually the plan is to make this available on an industrial scale. So regular people would be eating beef grown not from an animal, but rather from in a laboratory, in a factory, more like a farm, or growing like, yeah. So the question would be, how does this work with the question of limb from a living animal? For example, if they take the initial piece of meat from a living animal and it's grown, and a year down the road it's being marketed, the animal is still alive, would it be permissible to eat this? And I asked a couple of rabbis, and their reply, well, one rabbi is a dayan, the other rabbi is a kosher food expert, and they looked at me like, well, why would I even be asking the question? It should be obvious, it should be something I can figure out, which surprised me, because it's, in my mind, it's not something I can easily figure out, and I wouldn't rely upon my own figuring it out. but their understanding is that this is something that a Noahide should be able to figure out. So when we start talking about what we're able to do and where we rely upon the scholars, I would suggest it's more of a partnership. We have to have the Torah scholarship has to be in the partnership, and that has to be through the people that have the innate direct connection to the Torah that exists with the Jewish Torah scholar that would not necessarily exist in the same way with a Noahide. Even a Noahide Torah scholar would not have that same level of connection to be able to understand these things. So as questions come up that are difficult, however we understand difficult, however Moses was told he was going to take the more difficult questions, when we are actually working these things out in real life, and not as today it's theoretical, but in real life when we're trying to figure these things out, we'll learn how to make this partnership work. And we'll learn how we have to rely upon the Jewish Torah scholar in these decisions. We're not going to be able to do these things on our own. But on another level, I mean, every court case that comes up has to be viewed as a unique situation. You can't treat each court case that would come up before a court has to be viewed as a unique situation, and it has to be looked freshly from the perspective of Torah. And the Noahide judges will have to have the ability to do this. So we're going to have to know how to work out this balance, how to work out this dynamic. And that'll be developed over time. This footnote 113, this is concerning a questionable situation that requires a Torah law decision. And deciding on an answer is equivalent to delving deeply into Torah. More so, a Gentile may not be ordained to teach or expound on Torah, because that is solely the spiritual assignment of the Jews. To be deeply involved in Torah and to delve into it for the purpose of deciding practical rulings on Torah law on a Torah law basis. This task is only given to observant Jewish Torah scholars who can be trusted in their explanations of the oral Torah, as already clarified in the author's introduction of this volume. However, for a matter which it's easily understandable from learning about the Noahide commandments, and the conclusion is obvious, it appears clear that a Gentile is allowed to decide upon it for matters of personal practical observance. But it is essentially difficult to decide an exact conclusion for Torah law in general, and lay persons do not have the objectivity and breadth of Torah knowledge to be certain that they are making the correct ruling. Now, this is all, it's all a living dynamic, and a lot of these are relative questions. And how exactly it is that there's the area, like I said, there's the area of Torah that requires the connection to Torah that only exists for a Jewish person. And then there's the areas that are areas of seichel, areas of intellect, that a non-Jew can also function in. And we've already been told in the beginning of today's reading that a non-Jew can delve into the areas of Torah that apply to the Noahide code. Therefore, obviously, the reasoning is not that the Noahide cannot delve into the areas of the Noahide code. He can. There is a level of connection that still requires the Jewish connection. to Torah, to the eternality, the divine nature of Torah that the Jew needs to bring into the mix. It's a necessary element. And again, how we work out this dynamic is something that'll be figured out over time. Halakha number 5. The secret part of Torah that is called Kabbalah is governed by the same principles as Talmud regarding the parts a Gentile may learn. This is the third part of the Torah that is Talmud, as explained in the Shulchan Aruch Harav Hilkot Talmud Torah 2:1, as explained earlier. For parts that do not relate to the Noahide code, it is delving into the Torah for its own sake, since Gentiles cannot learn anything practical from that, so there is no benefit for them. Shilukutei Sikot, volume 27, pages 246 and 247. This is the simple meaning of Tractate Haggadah 13a, that Jews may not teach the secrets of the Torah to Gentiles, and therefore Gentiles may not learn it themselves either. This is like the opinion of Tosafot Haggadah and other early Torah authorities. Also, one may not learn the original Kabbalah text, that's the Zohar, without a fitting teacher. And therefore, automatically, it is impossible for Gentiles to learn true Kabbalah by themselves. They would need to be taught by Jews, which is forbidden to a Jew if it extends to parts unrelated to the Noahide code. The trending matter is called popular Kabbalah. That's the and learning from false teachers are fake, and this is not part of Torah at all. Furthermore, Kabbalah must never be promoted or observed as a religion in and of itself. So the Kabbalah is part of the Gemara. The way it's been described here is part of the Gemara. It follows the same rules as the Gemara. And that's the more analytical, it's just an analytical, beyond the normal analytical. And it goes into the spiritual aspects of the Torah in a much more open manner. In the areas that relate to the Noahide code. So if we understand the footnote 111 and the list, the more restricted list, or there is the larger list that includes the first two parshas of the Torah, those areas would be permitted to study as far as we can go, which would take us into the Kabbalah. And also, we're allowed to study the Chassidus. So, in those areas that we're permitted to study, we're permitted to delve, those areas the Kabbalah is open to us, which is quite a lot. You know, even though it's a small fraction of the total, it's nothing to sneeze. It's a big deal that we're allowed to study this. More than many lifetimes could be spent, and you wouldn't reach the end of it. So stay away from goofy teachers that promote the Kabbalah. If they're promoting Kabbalah, you probably are not. They're probably not real. I've known people that are very cautious about explaining, cautious about mentioning the Kabbalah. Those are the ones that I'm more likely to trust. But they're not going to teach. But it still is worthwhile to hang out with them. But they're not going to teach it unless it might seem okay. And for a Noahide, that would be in the areas of the Noahide laws. So just study what you're able to study, grab a hold of it, and take it as far as you can. Thank you.